Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm here with Justine Clement. She is a breath worker, a breath coach, a forest bathing guide. You also take people into the sea. And this is in Britain. This isn't the Caribbean. So you're taking brave souls into the oceans around Britain. And you are also an entrepreneur. And I'm very looking forward to this conversation. Justine, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm sorry it wasn't a more precise summary of what it is that I do, but that pretty much encapsulates it all. Thank you.
Brilliant. And in fact, as we were going through this, as you came on, you mentioned that these all connect in some way. You mentioned elements. I wonder, maybe is that the place to start? How all of these things thread together, and then we can dive into the different aspects of what you do.
Yeah, okay, we'll start there and maybe work our way backwards. But yes, each thing that I do links to an element, but that's really just a succinct way of bringing it together, because I don't think we think about the elements too much around us, whereas at some point in our history, we were governed by the elements. But yes, breath for me is about, it's obviously the element of air, but for me, it's about connecting back to ourselves, because we've become a very mind-dominated species. And I think you talked about this in one of your earlier podcasts, but we want everything to be scientifically based and have a piece of paper to prove that it's valid or it's any good. And everything that we do is based around the mind and how do we think rather than how do we feel. So the breath work is connecting to the element of air, but it's also about reconnecting to ourselves and actually bringing our not to use too fluffy a word, but our energy, rather than it all being around our head, back into our bodies. And then the sea bathing, obviously, is linked to water. And that's got a couple of overall overarching benefits, which is about, again, it's about coming back into the body, because you can't think of anything else but the body when you're going into water. And as you touched on it, it is cold water, and all the waters off the coast of Britain or within the coast. I mean, rivers are even colder than the sea, but they're all classed as cold water. So you do have to have some level of experience or knowledge, or go with someone that you want to before going in the water. Because, I mean, actually in July this year, it got warmer, but it's always going to take your breath away. So immersing yourself in that cold water brings you fully into the present and makes you think about your body. But it's also great for soothing stress levels. And so I think with the sea bathing, it's about bringing us back into the present and again, concentrating a bit more on the body rather than thinking about things. And then the forest bathing is really a combination of all of that as well. And that is the element of earth. So in terms of mentioning that and the cold, I did something yesterday. I actually took my own shoes off and walked around something called a labyrinth, which is a little bit like a maze, but has a bit more of a history to it, of how we walked labyrinths in the past. And I thought I would take my shoes off, despite someone saying it's quite cold this time of year. I thought that it's not going to touch me. I go cold water bathing, and I'm always telling people to take their shoes off in the forest. Took my shoes off, and it was probably 40 minutes spent in this, walking around this labyrinth. Oh my gosh, my feet were absolutely like ice by the end of it. But with forest bathing, it's about reconnecting to that element of earth. And ideally, during some forest bathing sessions, getting people to take their shoes off and walk on the bare earth and actually feel that connection again that I feel that we've lost to the earth. And again, the forest bathing is also about coming back into the present and into the body, taking that energy, that busy mind energy, and bringing it down into the body. So those are the three that I generally work with. And I'm moving a little bit into the element of fire as well, which fire through the history, we sat around fires a lot more than we do now. We did storytelling, we passed on wisdom. So trying in a not too kind of out there kind of way, just to appeal to as many people as possible, to bring back that element of fire into our lives as well, and maybe gather around the fire, do a bit of storytelling, And that's something that I'm just kind of really learning about now, is about our missing connection to the element of fire. So that's where all of those come from, if that's a very quick summary.
Yes, no, I love that. And that makes sense. And in this sense of connection seems to be the theme.
It's all about connection, absolutely.
And we're always connected to something, right? But perhaps, as you said in your intro, most of the time we're connected to our thinking, our intellect.
Exactly.
This is
exactly. And I don't know where it's getting us. At the moment, things are a bit of a mess. And I don't know necessarily that it's worked. When I take people forest bathing, I talk about the fact that that we are nature. There's something called the biophilia hypothesis. And it's the idea that actually we've evolved in nature, and going back over, millions of years of human history, or the evolution of human beings, actually we evolved in a forested environment, and we've become disconnected to it. And the disconnection probably to nature happened when we went from being hunter-gatherers to moving into arable farming. So that would have been about, there's different reports, but around 11,000 years ago. So we then started carving up the land. So this is my bit, this is your bit, and not moving from one place to another, growing our crops, selling our crops. And then sort of moving into the Christian period, when we sort of put the church in between human beings and the divine, for want of a better word, God, whatever it is that means to you, something greater than that. I mean, most people don't use the word God anymore, but something greater than yourselves. We used to revere nature and maybe look at the sun and the stars and have a different way of operating. But then the church came in, and then it was very much about, certainly in I can't talk beyond that, but in Christian nations, it was very much about, you go to the church to find your wisdom. And then fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, and really when science came in, then we moved a bit further from nature. And I think for me, that all leads into a bit of a disconnection from ourselves, and moving up into the mind and moving away from the body, and the disconnection to nature and the planet, which I'm just, lots of people are now talking about whether it serves us. And in fact, I was reading an article this morning about the pursuit of growth. If we continue to pursue growth constantly, where are we going to end up? And the conversations are getting more and more serious as we move on. So I hope that with some of my work, I'm reconnecting, helping people reconnect to themselves through some of that work, and reconnecting to nature, which in effect would be ourselves, if you took into account the biophilia hypothesis that we are nature. Then I feel that will help people not only think about nature a bit differently and how we can look after the planet, but also ourselves, focusing on ourselves. Because I just find nowadays, most people that I see and that I work with, and I can feel it in myself as well, moving into overwhelm so much of the time, because we are so busy. And we're very much a doing kind of species nowadays. If we're not doing, we don't feel like we're worthy. I was certainly brought up in a family like that. My parents, my dad was an entrepreneur, but my mum helped as well in the business. And we're a family of doers. I still see it with my parents and my sister. And it's, to use that word again, it's undoing a bit of that and feeling comfortable being not in this space of kind of all these slightly tetchy emotions of anger, overwhelm. All the work that I do is about trying to help people mitigate some of that. I'm not saying that any of it is a miracle cure. It is. In the moment, it is a miracle cure. When I take people forest bathing, when I take people for breathwork sessions, and when we go into the sea together, they are miracle cures at the time. But of course, you then go back into your day-to-day living, and those effects, if you don't keep practicing them, then of course they're going to come in again. So for that reason, I don't say they're a miracle cure. But if you can introduce some of these tools into your day-to-day life, I see from each one of those, let alone if you actually put them all together, have an incredible effect on people. Really, really incredible.
Yeah. And when did this journey into connecting to the elements start for you?
Well, I think I used to do it when I was young. I mean, certainly with the forest bathing, I grew up in Cornwall, and I spent a huge amount of time out in nature. And then what happened? Well, and also I grew up with my father from 12, had a sports shop and a gym. And he, we were always we would go out walking the Cornish coast when we were young as a family, or we'd be in the gym, so there was always a physical kind of fitness side to me. And I was out in nature a lot, and I was in the sea a lot. We were lucky we had the North Cornish coastline, very wavy, and my dad would take me out at the weekends, and I was very comfortable being in the sea, and I knew how good it was for you. And I've always gravitated towards that. So all those elements, maybe not the breath work, but those elements of physical fitness and being outdoors in nature were always present when I was young. And then, I moved away, I started traveling, and I was always by water, but then I moved to London, and I've been in and around London probably for the last 25, 30 years of my life now. And there was quite a period in the middle where, I was doing the things that lots of young people do, going out, partying, not really thinking about any of the stuff that I'm talking about now. And I don't know where there was a change, but I think there was a bit of an issue with my own health, maybe not looking after myself. And I started to see a kinesiologist. It was, I don't know, probably 25 years ago.
What's a kinesiologist?
A kinesiologist, well, I don't want this to sound too mad either, but it's the idea that when we have an illness or a problem in our body, it's linked to something in the body that's maybe gone offline or isn't functioning properly. So maybe one organ, I think Katie Brindle was talking about the major organs, the 5 major organs as the kind of operating function of the body. When some of those go offline, kinesiology believes that there's a test to see which part of the body has gone offline, to use like a modern term. And they do something called muscle testing, and your muscle kind of, a different test will fire towards a different organ. So I don't remember because I'm not a kinesiologist, but for example, you could hold your hand out and they will push down on your arm, and that particular test will link to a particular organ. And if it's firing and operating correctly, then you'll be able to hold your arm out. It's quite fascinating. If it's weak for that particular test that they're trying you for, you won't be able to hold your arm out. So the kinesiologist will be lightly pressing on for example, for this test, you literally won't be able to hold your arm up. So there's so many different tests on the body. It's really fascinating. And so I began to realize that the body wasn't just a thing to be moved. I was very active, cycling, running, swimming, tennis. It was for me, the body was about moving it and, working it out. And then I realized that there was a connection to the mind and the body. And then at that time, there was a big surge in popularity of Ashtanga yoga. It was Madonna and different people, and Sting were really into Ashtanga yoga. So I started having a really deep practice in yoga, and it was a really slow evolvement of noticing my body in a different way to sort of working it out and moving it as quickly as I could. And I think it was a deeper practice of that with the kinesiology that then started. I'm really, really curious. I haven't had a hugely traumatic, I had, quite a nice upbringing, not too many issues really. So I don't come into the work that I do from a background of trauma. I do it from a background of curiosity, but also curious, a bit like the podcast is curious in terms of what does it take to be a better human and to live a better life. And so those kind of combinations, and for me, a bit of, some physical issues that I was dealing with, I just went into a whole exploratory pattern, really. And I'm really, really curious about people that are doing things that I've never heard of. But where I'm really interested is how you bring those into the mainstream. And my father always read the Times, and I would read the Style magazine. And I loved the way the Style magazine would present things that were really quirky. So, for example, I always remember they did an article on the chakras. Well, most people reading the Style magazine, that was probably 20 years ago, would just think that that was just a bit too way out there. But the way that they presented it was in a really digestible way for someone who doesn't want to get freaked out that they're reading something a bit too, a bit too woo-woo, a bit too out there. And that's what drew me really to breathwork. And I actually saw an article in that very magazine by the guy that I ended up training with, and it was a double-page spread about something called transformational breathing. It's about 15 years ago that I read it. And I just was totally fascinated by it, how breathwork can have such an effect on you, your life, how you react to others. So, on an emotional level, on a physical level, and on you could say a spiritual level, but you could say a closer connection to yourself, self-knowledge level. So for me, to answer your question, it's really come from a background of a bit of well-being in different areas, a curiosity, and then a thirst to kind of work out how could I overcome some of the challenges, the health challenges that I had at the time. And then forest bathing was the same. I think I read about it about 6 years ago, and I was just coming back into that connection. I think as you get past your kind of mid-30s, you start maybe to come back a little bit more out of that phase of partying and just thinking about yourself to a bit of exploration, and also what was it when you were younger that made you feel good. And I read about forest bathing, and I'm fascinated by Japanese history and culture. And I just went on a couple of days workshop to find out what it was all about. And these things, you can go and you can do your training. And actually, the training for forest bathing was over 3 years, but several long weekends. But it's the parts in the middle that actually are the bits where you really learn the most, when you're going out and you're doing it yourself. All these things take time, and it's the same with the breathwork. You can go, I spent a year training to be a breathwork coach, but it's in seeing the different clients and doing the breathwork myself and understanding what works, what doesn't work. I'm very realistic as well. I'll never say to someone, this is going to cure absolutely everything that you've ever worried about. But when I see the reactions that people have to all these things, then it just takes years to get that experience to really embody it yourself.
Right.
I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, you mentioned there was something, a bit, you're in London, you're exercising a lot, you're partying a bit, but there was sort of something off with your well-being that drew you to Ashtanga. What was it? Was it just a feeling of like, I could be more healthy, or was it something specific? Like what drew you?
No, it was something specific around my stomach, and I don't really know exactly what it was. But I don't really, I suppose I'll never really know, but I think definitely partying, being a busy person. I think it was a bit of a mixture of everything, and just feeling that things could be better, that I could be feeling healthier, that I could be on better form. So it was a bit of a mixture of the two, to be honest.
Right. And what was the impact of the Ashtanga? How did that affect you?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, because the story really fits in brilliantly to everything that I've said. So I did Ashtanga really because I thought you get great physical benefits from Ashtanga, because this was at the beginning of my journey. And look, at the amazing outcomes that someone like Madonna or Sting have had. I went into it from a physical aspect. And actually, when I look at when I do something, I always like to seek out who's the best teacher. And I ended up doing a session actually with, I think Sting or his wife was in the room, because it was really popular at the time, with the guru of Ashtanga yoga. He subsequently passed away. But even from that perspective, the room was very, it's very high energy, but the people that would teach you were quite pushy. So would push you into postures and would push you into moving forward. And actually, I ended up with a couple of significant injuries, one of which ultimately led me to having I ruptured my cruciate ligament. I was actually skiing, but I think there was a lead up to it from pushing my knee beyond where it needed to go. So the lessons were there even with the yoga, which for me was really to slow down and pay more attention to my body. But I would get up, it was ridiculous. I would live in Balham and I would live on a first floor flat, and I'd keep my bike up there, get up at 5:30, trying not to wake anyone up, getting my bike down a couple of flights of stairs, cycling from Balham to Clapham Junction to do like a 6 a.m. class, cycle back, have a shower, get my posh clothes on for an office job, get back on the tube or cycle to work. I mean, it's just crazy. And I think this is the thing. We just live in this crazy space of just trying to fit so much in. So everything that I was doing in my outside life was really mitigating probably any of the benefits that I was getting from the yoga. But there was lots of things that I got from it that I kind of took forward, really, which was understanding myself and my body and my mental state, which I'd never really thought about before yoga, and as well as my breath work. Really, I'd never even thought about my breath before yoga. And even though the type of breath work that I do now is very different from a yogic breath, it was the start of really noticing if I slowed my breath down, if I noticed my breathing even, how does that change how I feel on a moment-to-moment basis? So there was a lot of grounding that came out of the yogic practice.
And that intrigues me because I've done a lot of yoga, and I've also done that routine of getting up for 6 a.m. Ashtanga classes, and it can be intense. And I can't imagine what it would be like if you then had a pushy teacher on top of already doing Ashtanga. But so how did that parry into the breathwork? Like, what's the difference between that type of yoga, the type of breath that you might experience in a yoga class, to what you then went on to learn?
So yogic breath is also called pranayama breath, and there's so many different types. There's over 1,000 types of those types of breath alone. And pranayamic breath or yogic breath is known as breath control because for example, there's one particular type that's called box breathing. You can sit at your desk and do it. Great. If you're feeling a bit tense, you breathe in for a count of 5. You hold for a count of 5, breathe out. So what you're doing is you're controlling your breathing. And it's the same with yoga. As you're breathing through your body, you're controlling your breath in different ways. So we would call that not as in male and female, but a masculine and a feminine type of energy. That would be more the masculine type of energy, which in Chinese would be called a yang, so a masculine type of energy, because we're controlling it. The type of breath work that I do would be more on the yin, so the feminine side, because it's about breath release. So we're breathing in, and it's quite different because we're breathing in through the mouth in the type of yoga that I do, which is called conscious connected breathing. So you're breathing in, but then the out breath is a release. And the reason that I like that is because of everything that I've spoken about already, is that we have so much control in our lives. I mean, I see it in my own life, but I see it in everybody else's, and I see it in the clients that come to me. We're very busy trying to control our environments to not let them go out of control. And also we have so many different things now to help us control our lives, from getting in our cars and our power steering, or, parking, or whatever it is. There's just control everywhere. So what I really like about this type of breath work, it's not about control. It's the out breath is all about the release. So that's where they differ.
Right. And so it's, and I can't help but want to try and practice it now. So I'm coming in through my mouth.
Yes.
And then
release. Yeah. So there are 5 different components to the type of breath work that I do. So the first is the mouth is open. And we don't advocate mouth breathing on a day-to-day basis. It's very specific for this breathing technique. So the mouth is open throughout. We're breathing into our abdomen, which is the case with quite a lot of breath work, but we're bringing the breath right down, because most people are chest breathers. We develop quite poor breathing patterns over the course of our lifetime. But if you look at a healthy baby, you'll see that both their chest and their abdomens are actually rising and falling with each breath. And we're using our diaphragm, which lines our rib cage, to breathe. But actually, as we develop poor breathing patterns for lots of reasons over our lifetime, probably about 70% of people are breathing quite shallowly into their chests. So we're bringing the breath right down into the abdomen, which stimulates our parasympathetic nervous system. So it brings us bodies down into that rest and digest mode. And the third part of it is a connected breathing, as per the title of it. And most land mammals have a connected breath, which means there are no pauses between the inhale and the exhale. But human beings are, I think, the only land mammal that doesn't have a connected breath. So what we're doing in this breath work is where there's no pauses between the inhale and the exhale. So it's almost like a circular type of breathing. So there are no pauses. And when there are with people, I delete the pauses with someone by just speeding it up slightly. And it's quite tricky to go into exactly why it is in a scientific way. But the research that they've done is this type of breathwork is called a self-healing modality. So even as I'm there as the facilitator, it's the body's own intelligence that's doing the healing, and that's understood to be from doing the connected breathing. So the third part is it's connected. The fourth part is about the exhale, and it's very short and it's soft. So if I had a mark on my glasses, the exhale will be very short and soft, or a bit like the end of a yawn. Okay, and then the fifth component,
like a puff sort of thing.
Exactly, just a little puff, and not forced. And actually, we can tell a lot about people's lives and people's patterns by how they breathe. And so forced breathing or, really labored out breath would tell us something about the person or maybe their lifestyle. And then the fifth point is about the inhale. And that's really where we talk about the receiving, and breath is all about life or life force. I know you touched upon that with Katie Brindle. So in the East, they would call, even in Sanskrit and yogic tradition, breath is known as prana or chi or ki, which when you translate that means life or life force energy. So what we're saying with the breath is when you're breathing in, all the focus is on the inhale. And we try not to get too much into figures, but it's a ratio of about 4-1. So 4 on the inhale, 1 on the exhale. But we don't want people to go too much into their minds in terms of thinking about the 4-1. So the inhale is considerably longer than the exhale. And it's for that reason we're bringing oxygen into the body or life force into that body in the inhale. So it's feeling the belly expand as you inhale, and then and the other thing is
very different to how we normally breathe.
It's very
counterintuitive, right? And they're very different to the yogic thing where you're trying to sort of almost like weight them equally, or very often in yoga you try and extend the out breath longer than
exactly. Very, very different. And you wouldn't be sat up doing this. It's a little bit more tricky. We can do it sat up, of course, but not anything really beyond just practicing it. So people are either lying down flat, depending on if they've got any respiratory or heart, so any blood pressure issues. They'd either be lying flat or just slightly semi-elevated. So this isn't the type of breathwork that you would do when you're at your desk at work feeling stressed. This is a type of breathwork that you would carve out a little bit of time. You would either do your self-practice, or you would come to someone like me, or you could go to a group workshop and do it. But it's very specific. And like I said, I don't advocate mouth breathing outside of this technique, but it's just very specific to the session. And really the session can last anything. I practice probably 6 days a week, and I will do a half-hour session. But you could do 10 minutes, but you could join a workshop, or you can do an online workshop as well, and that could be anything up to an hour. But I guess the norm would be about 45 minutes if you were going to have a session with a practitioner like myself.
Right. And so how did you first learn about it? What, Star Magazine?
Star Magazine, I saw it. And actually, I was running a company at the time called Unmissable, which was creating travel experiences for big consumer brands. And I was coming up to a 10-year anniversary, and I just read this article, and the owners of the business said, what would you like as a gift? And I was like, well, I'd really like to go to the retreat of this guy that I'd read about who was in Lanzarote. He's British, but he's in Lanzarote. And I went out, and Lanzarote is actually an amazing island in itself. I know it has a reputation from Michael Palin. Lanzarote. It's beautiful. It's volcanic, and it's a really lovely island. So I went to the retreat, and, I love cycling. So I hired a bike, and I spent 4 days out there. And it was really transformational, actually. And I just came back, and I was, I loved the job that I was doing. I absolutely loved it. So I wasn't about to do anything radical at that stage. So for me, it was always quite a slow burner. And I'd come to it, I'd come back to it, I'd try other things. But I stayed very good friends with the guy that ran that retreat. And in the interim I've done so many different things, because really coming back to that curiosity and how to live a better life, I did so many things in between. And then about, I don't remember the time frame, maybe 2.5 years ago, I just felt like I was actually advising someone else who phoned me up, a friend's wife from Italy, who had tried a breath session, something similar, and was just totally blown away by it and wanted to know how she could train. And I was giving her advice of the guy that I went to the retreat with, because by this time he was now training people to be breathwork coaches. And then I put the phone down, and I just had this feeling of over the next week of, I've never really had that before, not so obvious, that's what I wanted to do. And I'd already started my process of training to be a forest bathing guide. And I just felt this slow kind of move towards this idea of helping people to reconnect to nature and reconnect to themselves. And I can't really explain it beyond that, but it was just a really strong feeling. I don't know if you call it intuition, that this is what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing.
Right.
So that's how it happened.
And I'm curious, so when you did the first retreat, you described it as transformation. How was it transformation?
Little bit like I described with Ashtanga yoga. It was it's a deeper connection to myself. I mean, when you do this type of breath work, if you were to try it, maybe we could do a session one day, my teacher describes it as it blew the doors open of I think people can have various experiences. So we talk about the experiences with breathwork into 3 categories, and one is a physical level. You don't necessarily know it whilst it's happening, but on a physical level, your cells, a bit like a car, the car relies on petrol or fuel to run. So the body cells rely on breath, really. Breath is oxygen and energy for its fuel. So when you're doing a breathwork session, and on that retreat particularly, you're doing 2 intense sessions a day. So what you're doing is bringing a huge amount of oxygen into the body. So you're refueling the cells of your body. So on a physical level, you're feeling quite amazing. And on an emotional level, what happens over the course of our lifetime is to be human really is to have emotional baggage. We all have it, and we accumulate it, because what happens is we start to feel an emotion, and we will say that emotions are energy running through your body. So say you're feeling anger or grief or some of those kind of emotions, And maybe you're out in the supermarket, or maybe you're at school, or maybe you're at work, and somebody really upsets you, particularly in British culture. We're taught to, be good people, good boys and girls, not explode in the supermarket or in the middle of the office. So what happens is the body basically goes, okay, we're not going to deal with this emotion right now, which is energy in effect coming through the body. We're not going to deal with it right now. We'll park it and we'll deal with it at another time. And so what happens is there becomes an accumulation of this emotional baggage, so this emotional energy over the course of our lifetime. And that's why sometimes people start to behave quite erratically, or that I don't particularly like the phrase, but the midlife crisis. Quite often these things come up in midlife because the body gets sort of bogged down with all these different things that we haven't really dealt with, from big things like divorce or death to maybe the smaller things that kind of eat away at us over time. So we talk about the body as being like a dusty old filing cabinet. And what we're doing with this type of breathwork is we're going in with a feather duster and we're opening up the drawers and we're dusting out this emotional baggage that's been accumulated, or this energy, through the breath, by bringing the breath into the body. And it releases different types of emotions during a session. So people will have a range, and literally everyone is different in the sense that there's 9 billion people on this planet. Everyone, without doubt, everyone that comes to a session has a different reaction. And each time they come, they'll have a different reaction. So it may be physical. So people may shake, because what you're doing when you're doing this type of breath work, you're bringing more oxygen, so more oxygen and energy into the body. They may get like a tingling, so they feel their hands and their feet, their body may shake, which is a way of releasing emotional baggage, or you may call it trauma. The word trauma is quite overused these days. So some people's body may shake a lot. Some people have a lot of crying, so they feel this emotion from various things that have happened over their lifetime release. They may have a very big emotional reaction, so a lot of tears. They may have very quietly, very gentle. Some people have more, we may call it a spiritual reaction, but it might be just, some people don't like that word, so don't always use it that much, but something else that happens. So memories that surface from the past. So in the sessions, each session will have been very different for me during 4 days of having 2 sessions a day. But if you think about all those things that are going on in the body, in the mind, with the emotions, then quite a lot gets released. And then you're going out and you're walking, or I was cycling as well, going out into nature, and actually getting away from your day-to-day life, even if it's just for an hour. And people come to me for an hour, or sometimes they'll spend half a day. It doesn't have to be on a retreat in Lanzarote. They're taking time out of their lives to have, to take a break and focus on themselves. So at that point, for me, I had 4 days of really focusing on myself and all those different things happening to me during those sessions. So for that reason, it was quite profound.
Right. And I suppose I resonate with it, because from the trauma release aspect, to the extent to which that's been a big part of my story and journey, not through breath work, but through therapeutic interventions, right?
Yes.
To talking therapies and feelings-based therapies. So I really relate. Well, that's been enormously transformational, for me in my life, and it's intriguing for me to consider that there are other modalities that can get you potentially to the same place.
And for me, it always feels like less hard work, I think, than actually having to talk through it. Actually lying there and having a breath session and have some of the same benefits as you would with a talking session. I think, to me, I find that quite appealing. But, there's so many different ways and access to the things that we've accumulated, trauma, emotional baggage over the course of our lifetime. There are so many fascinating therapies and modalities that are available, but this happens to be the one for me that I found most profound.
Yeah. And I guess that experience stayed with you, and ultimately, years later,
it always stayed with me.
Calling.
I went back for another retreat. I spoke to other people about it. So friends went, and as I said, I stayed friends with my teacher. So, I went out on another trip to Lanzarote, and I had a few more sessions. And also my teacher would, at the time he was my therapist, I suppose, my breathwork coach. He would come to London and I would see him. But it would be in between, discovering different things. But it was the one, I think, I stopped yoga because of, I could have probably gone into other types of yoga, but I stopped yoga because of the extent of my injuries. And I felt like there must have come a point where I felt this isn't the right type of yoga for me, because it's feeding into, I'm an Aries, which is a kind of, we're quite busy people generally, most Aries. I certainly am one of them. And so it probably wasn't the right type of yogic practice for me. But the breath work was, I think, the one thing that has stayed with me throughout all the things that I've tried. And to such an extent that I then felt that I wanted to pass it on to other people, learn how to do it even more deeply, because in that process of learning to be a practitioner or teacher, a therapist, there's lots of different words for it. You also learn, or it elevates your learning about yourself as well, because I think in order to be a good coach, a good practitioner, a good therapist, is to actually have done the work yourself. So in learning not just how to take people through a session, you also, you've talked about your own therapy. I've done a lot of my own therapy as well. I've done various things over the years. And so I've understood a bit about, what's now called the shadow side. So what are the things that trigger me? I've done a lot of work on myself. So that's really important, as well as just learning a technique to take people through. It's all those things that you've been through yourself and you've discovered about yourself. And, in the process, we had to do a lot of case studies when I was training to be a breathwork coach. So all those things have had an effect and brought me to where I am, from just going and having a session myself to actually becoming very committed to it on a personal level in terms of my own practice, and then taking people coming to me for sessions.
Yeah. And so you reach that stage where in parallel you're doing your breathwork training and the forest bathing.
And I never realized that I got overwhelmed, actually, because I am a person historically who I see new things, a bit like maybe people like diamonds or shiny things. When I see new ways of kind of being and learning and interesting things, and I've got a tendency to try too many things. But I always thought that actually adding the breathwork into the forest bathing would be fine. But actually there came a point when I was really in the midst of my training and really just getting, I started doing forest bathing talks and taking organizations on forest bathing walks. And actually I realized that I was getting a bit overwhelmed with the amount of information and learning, because I want to do things properly if I do something. And in fact, I love that kinesiology. 25 years ago, I actually went on a 4-week training course. But I thought, if I'm going to be anything like the woman that was teaching us, this is going to be a lifetime of learning. I always want to be as good as the person that is mentoring me. So I maybe I put too much pressure on myself, but I felt quite overwhelmed in the early days of when I brought the breathwork into the forest bathing training. But that's really, that's over the last few years. That's all ironed out now. But yes, it was interesting. But what I really like now, which maybe I didn't realize at the beginning, is combining the two. I featured on another podcast called Postcards from Midlife, and I took the presenter Trish Halpin out for a session which combined forest bathing and breath work. So leading people on a journey through the forest, and we come to a sort of a camp that I've created in the forest. Very warm, very safe, under a tree. So this one particularly was under a very old yew tree. And actually having that combination of the breath work in a place where you feel very safe and held within a forest is, for me, really, a very, very powerful combination, quite life-changing. So actually, I don't know if I thought that at the beginning, but now, if I can, is to get people out into the forest. I would do it all the time. If we lived in Lanzarote, for example, where the weather was great all the time, then I think I would probably just offer that. But obviously we've got the weather conditions in the UK to consider. But as much as
you just got to bring them all together, put everyone around a fire.
Well, that's the fight, exactly. Then maybe that's the dream in the future, having a place in the forest where you could combine all those different elements would be wonderful. I'm sure I will offer that at some point.
Yeah. And so, explain to you a little bit about what forest bathing is, because I must admit, I'll just own up to something. You said, it took you, several years to train to teach people to forest bathe. And what do you mean? Like, is it just a walk in the forest? What do you want about?
Exactly. And actually it could be, when you go forest bathing, it's a series. In forest bathing, they're called invitations. And I'll backtrack to what it is in a moment. But invitations, which in effect are exercises, but because that word has connotations for people to school or to work, we call them invitations. And also it's because you don't have to do them. We invite you to do them. Actually, you can go and you can look those up online. And actually, I've created a series of, I call it forest bathing in your pocket. So a series of guides, you can put your headphones in, have your phone, which obviously is not ideal, but as long as you're keeping your phone just for that, you can wander around the forest and you can do forest bathing on your own. And once you can either, it's the same with the breath work. You've got all the different levels. And for both the practices, I would say it's like the gym. I mean, obviously you have to pay a fee to go to a gym, but you can go to the gym once you paid your fee. You can go to the gym. You can go by yourself. And that can be fine. Some days it can be not so good others. And actually you look back and you realize that you've been cruising along. You can go at some point. You can go at the beginning, probably would be best, with a personal trainer. And that will show you what it's like when you do it properly, and you can really set a benchmark for yourself. And then you can never go back to the personal trainer, and you can keep going at the gym, or at some point you get to the point where you're like, oh, hang on a minute, I've gone a bit off the boil. I think I'll go back to my personal trainer, or I could go to a class. I could go to a group session. There's always a free point with the breath work. You can go online and you can put, maybe not so much my type of breath work, but you can go to a workshop, and that will cost you, an relatively insignificant amount of money to go to a 2.5, 3 hour session. You can learn the technique. And if you're committed and you're dedicated, you can go off and you can do it by yourself. Or with the breathwork, I have a series of audio guides that you can use. So I always use an audio guide, or you can just listen to music. Once you've got the technique, off you are. You're off and running. Same with forest bathing. You could literally go and you could read online some invitations, and you could go off in the forest and you could go for your walk. And that works sometimes, and other times it doesn't. I know that for myself, because you may take your phone with you and then you think, okay, I've got these invitations, but then the busy mind comes in and it goes, maybe what was that ping? Or I just check that text, or I'll just do that. What happens by nature is we get distracted, and it's the same with the personal trainer. You're there, and he's keeping, or she is keeping you on track. It's the same with forest bathing. You can very much do it, and I, provide some information on the website as to what you can do, or you can pay very little. I can't remember, £15 or £20 for the forest bathing in your pocket. Off you go. You can have that for life. But if you come forest bathing, again, it's not an expensive experience, really. You're coming for 3 hours. You're coming with a group. You can come and you can do that, and then you can think, I'm off and running now. I've really learned it a bit better from someone. I'm off and running. So those are the reasons or the parameters that you can use. You're absolutely right. Forest bathing is totally free to anyone, and that's the beauty of it. But if you think you might get distracted or you won't be quite sure how to do it, then come and join a group session. And forest bathing is predominantly done in a group setting because actually we come back and share. And I really like that element of it. So whilst we're teaching people to have a connection with the forest and with nature and teaching them how to do that through a series of invitations, you come back and you share each time. But in terms of what it is it was developed in Japan. So forest bathing, which is quite some people that I've trained with here maybe don't like that translation because people still get confused and think you are going for a swim in the forest. But
I actually had the image of covering yourself in leaves or something and rubbing leaves over your body or something.
I haven't had that one before, but yes, but it's a translation. So Shinrin-yoku translates as forest bathing, or as a longer translation, it translates as, there's lots of different translations of it, but taking in the forest through your five senses for a greater sense of well-being would be a very long sort of translation of that. And it was born, Shinrin-yoku then in Japan was born in the 1980s. And we kind of all know the classic of the Japanese businessman that was burnt out. What really happened in Japan was, it's a very rural country. It's about something like 70, maybe even higher percentage of forest cover in Japan. But obviously then you've got Tokyo, and there was a very big move towards living in the cities, I think from the 50s onwards. And in the 80s, the Japanese government realized there was high instances of inflammation-related diseases, and also, as we know, quite high stress levels. And we'd all heard about that. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries set about taking on, over the years, a couple of scientists who have written many books. They're both still alive, Dr. Miyazaki and Dr. Ching Li, who would take groups of Japanese businessmen out into the forest and lead scientific experiments and research, taking blood samples, saliva samples, testing their sleep patterns, and coming up with a huge range of scientific research, which still goes on to this day. And there's a huge amount that you can look up, proper scientific reports online, or you can go and read maybe Guardian articles, all sorts of things if you want it written in a bit of an easier format in terms of the main headlines of the research that they discovered. But I can't remember the figures now, but they've spent millions of dollars, pounds in this research, which is still going on. And if you go to Japan, it's a bit like we're starting to do now in Britain with green social prescribing. And they're doing that in various counties. I live in Surrey, and they're starting to really look at green social prescribing now. And obviously that's escalated since we've realized collectively what an amazing effect nature has on us through the pandemic. So in Japan, when you go to the doctor, if you've got something like high blood pressure, high stress levels, you're not sleeping, depression, the doctor will take you down two different routes. You can go down the more traditional, what we would consider the traditional route with tablets or therapy, whatever it might be. Or, for example, blood pressure, you would have the tablets, or depression, you would have whatever, the Prozac. Or you could go and have a Shinrin-yoku experience. And there are around something like 64 centers in Japan set in forests where you will go with a guide for a certain number of duration. I think the minimum is 3 hours. And I imagine in Japan, you can probably stay for quite a period of time. And you will have go on Shinrin-yoku experiences to help you with your blood pressure, with your stress levels, with your sleep. Because the research, and this is why I like forest bathing, is because the research backs it up. Breathwork, they're still in the early days of doing a lot of research with breathwork, which is quite incredible, really, because it's been around for thousands of years and the benefits have been seen for thousands of years. But I like it because I can explain to people before a session where it's come from and why it's good for you, because they'll feel it. But I think it's quite good, with modern human beings, it's quite good to explain to them as well the background and the science. So the main sort of headlines of the scientific research is that if you have high or low blood pressure, it will regulate your blood pressure. So the first set of scientific research that they did was taking, I think, 12 Japanese businessmen and taking them for 3 hours into the forest. And then that was, I think, in the morning. And then in the afternoon, they took them for 3 hours to a shopping centre and just measured. And you can imagine what the difference in results were. But things that you wouldn't have ordinarily expected. So the regulation of the high and the low blood pressure. There's various different researches, but sleep improving by 15%. One that I think is the most fascinating, which is about what trees give off, particular trees. And this is where we're doing a lot more research in Surrey, actually, through an institute in Surrey about the types of trees that we have here versus in Japan. But particularly, they have a lot of cedar trees in Japan. But trees and all plants give off something called phytoncides. So these are chemicals, really. Yeah, like essential oils that the trees give off. And that helps them to ward off attack from insects or, maybe deers, different attacks that the trees may get. They give off these chemicals to ward off attack. But what's really amazing is when we breathe in these phytoncides, what they discovered in Japan is they boost what's called our NK, which stands for natural killer cells. And those are the cells that go around the body that scavenge for sort of dying or cells that aren't quite perfect, but also for cancer cells. And going for a period of 3 hours in the forest and breathing in these phytoncides, these essential oils, boosts your NK, your natural killer cells, for up to a week. If you spend a day in the forest, it will boost them for up to a month. And what's really great is you've got all these scientific research papers in Japan to back all these findings up. That I've spoken about the regulation of blood pressure, but also the effect that it has on your nervous system, so on your vagus nerve, and putting the body into what's called, you have two different types of nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. This is relevant to the breathwork as well, but I've spoken about it briefly before, but we spend a lot of time in our head. So we talk about it as being an inverted triangle. So the energy is all going upwards here. When you do your breathwork or when you go into the forest, what we're doing is we're bringing that energy down into the body and we're relaxing the body and we're putting it into the parasympathetic nervous system mode, which is the rest, digest and relax mode. So what they've discovered in Japan is the effect of being in the forest and what that has on your parasympathetic nervous system. When you only need to look at people, when I have people come, I have all sorts of people come. I had a lady come to my last session who wrote to me several times before the session because she was bringing her teenage son. He was, really into gaming. She'd lost connection with him. And actually she asked him as a favor to her for her birthday present if he would come along to the session with her. And he was a bit like, yeah, all right, Mum, I'll do it. And when he arrived, we all gathered, other people within the group, and the mum gathered, and the son was still in the car. And she's like, "I'm really sorry. He wants to finish his game that his game that he's on." He didn't arrive, so we sort of walked to the start point. She said he'll catch us up. So he arrived a bit kind of in that energy, and by the end of the session, and actually she wrote to me afterwards, and she was just overjoyed because in some parts of the session, we asked people to pair up to do invitations, like I spoke to you about exercises. And I thought at one point, I thought there's no way he's going to want to pair up with his mum, but he did. And by the end of the session, he had his sort of hat or his hood sort of pulled down over his sort of face, his eyes. And I was like, "How did you find the session?" He pulled his hood off and he was like, "You know what? It was really good." And she was just overjoyed by the interaction that they'd had together. She wrote me a lovely note afterwards in terms of what he was telling people in the family when he got home, which is really unexpected. But it took her out of her sort of anxiety of how he was, her disconnection with him. It took him out of his, I'm not saying it's anxious to play games, but you're in a very different state. But him in a very different state when he came into the forest and by the time he'd finished being in the forest. So it really puts people into a very different state of mind, which tends to last quite a while from my own experience and the experience I've had of others. But again, it's down to that person as to what they do beyond the session. But it has a very relaxing effect on our nervous system. And that's been proven by research. And there's another element of that, which I spoke about earlier, the biophilia hypothesis, which is that we've actually evolved in nature. And actually, it was only really take those 11,000 years ago that I spoke about when we moved from being hunter-gatherers and maybe started building little houses for ourselves, and particularly speeded up from the Industrial Revolution when we started spending less and less time in nature. But we've evolved in nature. And if you look at our feet, it's like, well, have you ever looked at your feet and wondered why they are like they are? Well, they were used, they were created, for want of a better word, to help us climb up trees. And when we're in a forested environment, all that kind of messiness of nature, there's no structure to it. Actually, that has a very calming effect on our body. And there's research done by two people called Kaplan, and they've termed it soft fascination. And it's that idea when you let your eyes wander, so you could lie on your back and you could do cloud gazing. But what we do in the forest is I get people to lie down on a sheet and gaze up into the canopy of the trees. I can honestly say every time I do that, it is really hard to get people up from it. People are exhausted and they're overwhelmed. And this comes back to what you were saying before, can you not just go for a walk in the forest? You can, but how many of us, myself maybe included, would go into a forest and would just lie down and look up at the trees? Particularly if you're a woman, you'd sort of be a bit anxious about that. When you're in a group and somebody's taking you out, and you're as a group, by that point, I do it sort of a bit later into the session, you've all got to know each other a little bit.
It's not like the first thing, right, everyone?
No, it isn't. But you could, to be honest, it's absolutely fine as well. There'd be no reason to. I mean, you're all, nobody's on top of each other. I mean, you're all spread out, but you're just looking up. And it's so difficult to get people up when they're down there because they're just like, oh my God. And it's another scientifically a proven bit of research is that the eyes, when they're looking around at nature, rather than being in a square box of the house, we weren't developed for that. And of course, we're modern human beings and our evolution is sped up very quickly. And this research is based on the idea that actually we've evolved in nature and that's where we feel most at home. But sometimes we may have forgotten that. So I hope that's answered your question. Very long answer.
Well, that is very
there was a lot to tell you about
my question. No, that's that's great, and I feel enlightened. And I've been in forests a lot. I spend out go canoeing through the forest near where we are with my kids. But I don't consciously think, am I connecting through all of my senses? I certainly don't lie down and gaze at the canopy. So there are obviously several aspects to explore in terms of what we can be doing when we're in a forest.
Yeah. And I think just to explain to you about those five senses, even going in and getting people just to, so for example, with the hearing sense is, I can hear the birds, for example, outside now, just isolating the other senses. We're a very, very visual species. And I'm not saying we don't do visual things in the forest because I've spoken about gazing up at the canopy, but we do lots of other things that actually close off the senses. And things like listening in the forest. So listening to bird song that's right near you, or maybe in the distance, particularly where I do quite a lot of my forest bathing sessions is with the Surrey Wildlife Trust. And we've got this lovely little private nature reserve. But beyond that, in the distance, I mean, quite a bit in the distance, but there's main roads, there's the M25 at some point, depending on there, if you're there in the winter or the summer, maybe there's no leaves, you can hear things in the distance. So you're beginning to isolate off your senses. And a bit like you associate with people who, have little vision or no vision, we always talk about their other senses being heightened, or they talk about their other senses being heightened. It's a bit like heightening your senses for your hearing. But I don't know about you, but I was always brought up, I go in a shop, my parents would be like, don't touch anything. Those simple kind of instructions mean that maybe you go through life and you don't touch a lot of things, and certainly not out in nature. Or that's poisonous. Mushrooms, that's poisonous, don't touch it. Or that's poisonous, don't touch it. For a plant, we don't really know, because we're so disconnected from nature and from our plants, what's in our hedgerows, we don't really touch anything. So again, coming back to when you're with someone, or when you've at least done a session, you begin to know what you can and can't touch. I mean, to be honest, there's most things you can touch in the forest, but I, get people to pair up. Again, we close down the visual sense and start to touch things. And just touching the bark of a tree or some moss has a very amazing effect on people, because they maybe haven't done it since they were a child. And quite a lot of the things that we do in forest bathing, so I can only speak for my sessions, because each person that you'll go to will do a different forest bathing experience for you, but is just by just noticing what you're touching and relating it back to childhood memories. But in terms of that, is really expanding your sense of awe and wonder. And I'm really, really fascinated by that. I read a book. In fact, I met the author. He's Italian, but lives in London. I'm trying to remember the name of his book now, but it was all about increasing your sense of awe and wonder. And I went to a talk years ago with a couple of people who were talking about this and how we've lost our sense of awe and wonder. And when we're in the forest, I really focus on that. I focus on that thing, because as adults, we don't give ourselves permission to have fun. And that's another point. Forest bathing is not all serious. And I think you touched on this in another podcast, which is this well-being space. Sometimes people think it can be quite serious. The forest bathing is a real mixture of having some fun and not being serious, but being quiet, having quiet time and mindful time with the forest. And those, parts of isolating your senses are quiet time, but also they're having a bit of fun, pairing up with someone else, getting them to guide you around the forest and feeling different things. So there's lots of different levels to it, and one of which is engaging your sense of awe and wonder whilst exploring the senses and the sense of smell. If you live in a city, you don't realize it, but you close off your sense of smell, because there's quite a lot of things in a city that don't smell very nice. You get quite a mixture of different smells in a city, or even maybe when you're out in nature and there's lots of, cow pats or whatever it is. We don't necessarily engage our sense of smell that much. We might do when we're going to a restaurant and some food smells nice, but do we go around sniffing some of the plants? Or we might do with the rose in the summer, but actually in the forest, I'm getting people just to, sniff bits of moss that are on the trees, or dig, maybe if people don't want to do that, I sort of dig into the forest floor. There's thousands of years of leaf fall. If that forest is in an ancient forest where there's literally, hundreds, thousands of years of leaf falling and beautiful, rich soil, just dig a little bit and pick that up and get people to smell it, or even do it themselves. Always people say it reminds them of childhood, or some people will describe it as, which is beautiful, it's incredibly touching, is it smells like home. And that when somebody said that to me, for me, that is a link back to the fact that we have evolved in nature. And I used to play a lot out in my garden. I had my own little patch of garden where I grow little vegetables, and I'd always have my hands and, my feet maybe in the soil. So for me, maybe that would be the same, but maybe for people who have evolved in the city, grown up in the city, they would have a different response. But it's all positive to that smelling of the soil. I've never had anybody had a bad reaction to that. So you don't do that, because generally it's one of the most common things people say to me is, I spend loads of time out in nature, take my dog for a walk. It's already different when you take your dog for a walk, because you're focusing on your dog, calling your dog back. Where's your dog going? Is it going to fight with another dog, or has it wandered off? Your focus is not on yourself, and it's not on nature. And it's the same when you go walking. Most of the time we're going to have a phone on us, either for safety or because we're waiting for a call. That further disconnects us from our surroundings, so we get distracted. It's very, very different when you come and somebody is leading you and taking you on a session, because you don't get distracted, because they're always reminding you. And it's a bit like the breath work. When you're doing your own practice, sometimes the sessions are great, other times you get distracted. Whereas if you've got someone, or you've got an audio guide to remind you, it brings you back. So it's about providing lots of different tools for people at different price points and at different requirements.
Right. And it sort of leads back to where we started this podcast on the theme of connection. This is
connection.
This is all about connection. And it actually chimes with we had another episode of the podcast, and someone was citing research of how being in nature enhances our creativity. And that links to what you spoke about in terms of awe and wonder. And also made the point, only if you don't have technology. So the benefits are dependent on you not technology.
I have not done this with people, but I went on a wonderful 24 hours of living and being outside with somebody that had grown up in the Sinai desert and used to run sort of silent retreats there. And I don't know if you've ever tried or ever discussed on your podcast water divining. You know those rods?
Oh, yes.
Them. They're copper rods, and they cross over when water is present. But the body is 70% water. And basically this man showed me, and it was quite incredible, really, what happens when you've got your phone on you, and not even when you've got your phone on you and switched off, but that it's still emitting some sort of, I don't know, would you call that electromagnetic energy? I'm not quite sure. But basically, he got me to stand a distance from him with my phone. And I don't know if you know, but human beings have an energy field. And depending on how we're feeling, if we're quite stressed, that energy field tends to be closer to our body. And if we're full of gratitude, feeling great about life, that tends to extend. And if you think that's a bit crackpot, I mean, it's not. We're just learning about all of these things in the West. But the way that you can check that for yourself is with animals. And if you go into a field where there's a horse or some horses, and they're quite far away in the other field and they're facing the other direction, what you'll discover is you can come really, really quietly, and they can be quite far away, so they won't hear you. They will turn around because a horse's energy field is really quite large. So they will sense you're coming into their energy field, and you can experience that by some people that you really like and some people that you don't, or you feel that somebody's coming a bit too, I think you say, you're coming into my personal space. It's all about that energy field. So we were already kind of out in nature, but we hadn't properly gone into the forest and spent quite a bit of time. I think it was shortly after I'd driven up to see him sort of near the Cotswolds. And I had my phone on me, and he brought the rods up, and he'd walk from about 15 meters towards me. Had my phone on me, recently been in the car, and the rods crossed over because they're detecting, I think, the water in your body. Came up really close to me, say about, I don't know if you can see on there, but say about this close to me. And I think we tried it with the phone on and the phone off. There wasn't really that much difference. We then, I then put the phone to one side, so I had the phone nowhere near me. And he did the same process, repeated the same process. And I was, say it was 30 centimeters from me with my phone. It was probably let me just think about it. It's probably 2 meters without my phone. So my energy field had extended. Now, everybody's different with that energy field. And obviously, I practice breath work and do different things. I spend a lot of time out in nature. So maybe you don't need to really focus on the fact that it's 2 meters, 1 meters, whatever. The fact is that my energy field was much greater when I didn't have my phone on me. And why that relates to the forest is that actually it means that you're more susceptible to your environment in terms of a greater connection, to keep to the word of that seems to be of the focus of today. You're having a greater connection with your environment. You're more open. We then repeated that process after we'd spent 24 hours. We actually slept in the forest. And my energy, and we didn't have the phone. We didn't re-practice it with the phone. That wasn't necessary. But my energy field had expanded, I don't know, by about 6 times. So
wow.
It was incredible. So the thing that really stayed with me was the effect that a phone has on you and how it blocks your energy. People,
and that was a new perspective, because when I understood what she was saying in terms of it blocking your creativity, I was thinking that was because you're distracted, right? You're thinking
there's
about
that as well. I mean, that is right. What she would be meaning. But it puts another level on it.
It puts another level on it, right? Which I'd never considered. So yeah, that's fascinating.
Well, that's why I think it's a really amazing thing to get. We did this. We ran a series of retreats last year, getting organisations, some B Corp organisations, out into nature and doing breathwork sessions, forest bathing sessions, and also sort of journaling and creativity sessions. But doing it out in nature has, for me, another level. Again, if you can get your team out and you can get them spending time in nature without technology, so you're literally writing down the ideas and the creativity you come up with, and also moving. So maybe doing moving walks. There's a lot of people now doing therapy on the move and outside rather sitting somewhere. Also meetings, walking meetings, but being out in the forest, workshops, that's it, being out in the forest. The reason for this is because it expands our creativity beyond being in somewhere with 4 walls and sitting with electromagnetic devices.
Right. Well, we're coming on with time. I've actually got another commitment soon, but this has been a fascinating conversation, and very inspiring, enlightening, educational. I've really appreciated everything you've shared. Hopefully this will inspire a few people to explore breathwork and getting out into nature and doing the forest bathing.
Yeah, I really hope so. I hope it's touched some people on some level, even to try a couple of things. Look up an invitation online, just go out and try one thing. Even if you are going out with your phone or with a dog or with someone else, just try something. And with breathwork, so many type of different breathworks out there, but just these are all tools to help people with the bombardment and the overwhelmment that we so often feel. So coming back to these tools when you feel out of balance, I think is really what's necessary and required for our busy world.
Yes. Now let's tell people where they can find you, because I know you've got websites for all 3 of the. Well, 4.
Yeah, we didn't even touch on. Didn't touch on sea bathing. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's fine. So just to call out the URLs where people can find more.
So breathwork is wonderbreath.co. So there's not .co.uk or .com. It's just .co. And the forest bathing website is forestbathingmadeinbritain.com. Quite a long one. And then I run a community group down in Selsey, which is just near Chichester in West Sussex. And you can join any time for free for a swim throughout the seasons. We have a monthly gathering and some gatherings in between. And that's called the SelseySeaBathingSociety.com.
Awesome. And we'll put links into the description. Well, thanks once again, Justine. This has been fantastic, and I'm taking things. I'm gonna I've always known the phone thing, and I'm just gonna make it much. I'm gonna be disciplined around whenever I get out into nature, just not having the phone even on me and off. Right.
That would be brilliant. Would be really brilliant.
Yeah. I'm gonna experiment with that. So fantastic.
Thanks very much.
And I'm inspired to check. Yeah, I'm going to see if there are any forest bathing sessions.
Yeah.
That I could get
I'm
to.
sure they would be. In fact, I'm sure
Yeah.
I could put you in touch with someone if you can't find them. I know
Brilliant.
lots of people running sessions. So
yeah, great. Okay, well, thanks once
thank you very
again.
much. Thank
All
you.
right,
Bye.
see you. Bye bye.